So welcome everyone to what is our second to the last webinar in this learning journey. And I want to really emphasize that on September 2nd, we have our final webinar of the learning journey, where I'll already give you a hint of why you should attend, because the topic of the last webinar of every learning journey we host is about how we are evolving beyond the learning journey, which is to say that the work doesn't stop, it actually deepens and becomes richer and more complex as we move out of the learning journey into the next steps. And we're going to be sharing a lot with you about structural changes, our expanded team in the design school, the way that we're flowing financial resources into different landscapes and supporting our members, knowledge commons, peer mentoring, on and on and on, just to say that we want to really paint a picture of how far we've come and where we're going. And we really want to encourage you to attend that session on September 2nd. But we can't get to the final webinar until we get to the second to the final webinar, which is today. And today I'm really excited that we have two very close friends and collaborators, Ralph Term and Bill Bowie from R3.0, who are here with us today to share about the work that they're doing. And I want to give you a little bit of context about why they're here in this learning journey, because we have actually been plotting and scheming together about this kind of coherence building since sometime around 2018, maybe even before that, because we've known each other for quite a while. But one of the things that we came together around last year was a lot of the patterns that we were seeing behind the scenes that were fragmenting the field, that were breaking down our coherence, that were undermining our collective ability to do the important work that needs to get done, and how each of us in our different ways try to support the building of coherence, the building of collaboration, the building of synergy, the building of shared direction and shared purpose. And so one of the things that really became a big organizing pattern this year is the way that R3.0 has moved, as they will share, I'm sure, in their presentation, from trying to avoid collapse to coming to accept collapse to realizing, oh shit, we're in the middle of collapse. And maybe what we need is as much resilience as possible in the midst of the ongoing and intensifying collapse. And oh, by the way, bioregionalism is something that R3.0 has been promoting since around 2015. This is not a new conversation to them. While a lot of people have jumped on the bioregional bandwagon in the last year, Bill and Ralph helped build the contemporary version of the bioregional bandwagon. And so they really devoted themselves to helping to braid the movement in the spirit of braiding sweet grass and weaving practices of indigenous cultures and bioregional weaving processes. And so the reason that they're here today relative to the theme of our learning journey is, what does the bioregional braiding have to do with bioregional organizing? Well, something we talk about a lot here in the design school is learning supports between bioregions, creating educational patterns, funding and governance supports, just mutual learning and shared culture, and by the way, friendship and connection. There are a lot of things that we depend upon to be able to do this work because it's hard work. And so the work of organizing our bioregions includes the ability for us to work together across our bioregions and build a larger coherent movement. And so we see the work of R3.0 with 10 years of creating what they call blueprints for systemic transformational change as basically systems conveners of convening multi-stakeholder groups and weaving them for common purpose, something that they have a lot of experience in, that when they recognize that they should make #1 priority is devoting those capacities to bioregional coherence, the coherence of bioregional organizing. It was very natural to bring them into this learning journey and share that part of the way that we organize our own bioregions is creating more coherent shared contexts in which we're doing that organizing work. And so I think what they have to share with us today is extremely relevant for that reason. And our learning journey is basically an on-ramp to their conference because their conference is 1 week after this learning journey ends. So you'll hear about that soon. But we want to encourage all of you to attend the R3.0 conference and to organize or attend one is organized by someone else, a bioregional confluence, which is helping people to organize their bioregions. So anyway, with no further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Bill and Ralph. And the format for today is that they're going to give a presentation about 30 minutes long. And then afterwards, I will facilitate question and answer and discussion. So you will get plenty of opportunity to speak with Bill and Ralph afterwards. But for now, I don't want to take up any more of the limelight, and I'll pass it over to them. So Bill and Ralph, over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Joe. And I'm just pulling the slides up. Let me see if I can get into the view. Oh, I see. I have to click the OK button about being recorded. And it's not allowing me to go into the view. There's an icon for doing that as well, I think, right?
Yeah, or the button that says slideshow. Yeah, just click on slideshow.
Great. Yeah. And that's showing it now, right?
Yes, we can see it.
Great. Okay, thank you. So thank you, Joe and Penny, for the really gracious introduction. We at R3.0 are very honored to be presenting to the design school, as both Ralph and I are design school members. And Joe, as you said, we have long been walking down parallel paths with you and with Penny. And so, much of this work is not only drawn from our experience at R3.0, but our collective experience. And as you mentioned, some of the things that we're doing are as a direct consequence of conversations between the design school and R3.0. In particular, I'm thinking about a year and a half or 2 years ago when you reached out to us, Joe, and talked to us about recognizing that our blueprint due process was one that might make sense to consider applying in the bioregional space. And we've done versions of that since that conversation. So that conversation is one of the kinds of things that's resonating throughout this session. So just to jump right into the presentation, and I'll be presenting a few slides, then Ralph will present a few slides, and we're going to go back and forth that way so that you get kind of both of our voices relatively equally spread out here. In addition to focusing on our conference and the confluences, Joe had mentioned in some of our preliminary conversation about this, about focusing on the fractal nature of bioregional work, drawing on, as you can see on the right, an article that I wrote, that Bioregional Earth, which Joe and Penny are co-stewards of that story, essentially is what that website represents, around bioregional fractal consciousness. So we decided to title this session, How R3.0 Stewards Fractal Bioregional Coherence. And so you'll be hearing more about that. I'm going to tee things up by just talking about two of those terms in particular. So fractal in a mathematical sense or in a ecological sense means self-similar across scales. And as we know, I'm sure everyone here is familiar with Peter Berg's definition of bioregions as geographic terrains and terrains of consciousness. And we're also aware that they are nested in scale. Something that came to me more recently is that it's not only vertically nested. So you think sort of like a watershed is part of an ecoregion, is part of a bioregion, is part of a continent, is part of the planet. But also I think that there is a self-similarity horizontally. In other words, between bioregions. So just as you can see that pine cones are self-similar at a fractal scale within themselves, but they're also similar, not exactly the same, but similar between pine cones. And I would argue that the same kind of applies for bioregions as well. So that's the fractal side of things. The coherence side of things, we kind of notice in physics that the term coherence applies to waves that are in phase, or the scientific term for this is constructive. Whereas incoherence emerges when waves are out of phase or destructive in the scientific lingo, which I think is actually very telling language if we apply it beyond physics. So as you can see here, the red wave is the blue and green waves together. And so when they are in phase, they essentially amplify to double their own individual impact. So neither of those waves could make that impact alone, but together they double it. And if they're out of coherence or decoherent, as Joe mentioned earlier, they actually zero each other out. And so that's the primary thing that we're looking to do at R3.0 is, invite coherence as much as possible, but primarily to avoid decoherence. Like decoherence is actually, I think, the more important thing to avoid. So one other sort of teeing up work before I'll hand this over to Ralph, which is we wanted to just briefly introduce our work overall in three pillars or gardens, to use the language of ecology. The three areas are bioregional convening, bioregional knowledge commoning, and bioregional self-governing. And our foundational goal is to support coherence through relationality, and you'll hear relationality returning again and again, particularly when we get to the conference. So we're seeking to do this by prioritizing the global pluriversality of the emergent bioregional movement, in particular creating opportunities for cross-cultural learning. And it's that cross-cultural element or the globalization of the bioregional movement that we feel like we're making some modest inroads on that front. So that's sort of a frame of the three areas. We're going to dive deeply into the convening side of things, but we wanted to give you just a brief overview of these. So the next few slides will focus on that. With that, I'll hand it over to Ralph to cover the slides on the convening.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. This is the first part of sort of like a three-pronged strategy. And I very much like the idea of the picture of gardening where you seed your plants. And our convenings is just a logic continuation of events that we held in the past, and then also building upon them to a certain degree. So first of all, the thing that made this one of the three parts of the pillar is that we believe that the act of convening advances multiple beneficial goals concurrently for the bioregional movement. So, for example, individual and collective education through experience-based demonstration and emerging dialogue, or community building through relationality, there it is again, and pro-social networking, or individual and collective skill building through the practical implication, and last but not least, self-governance through congressing, amongst other things. And you already see here through the wording that has been chosen that convenings isn't a separate thing. It is interwoven with knowledge building, but also with self-governance processes that are conveyed partially through convenings. So we have pursued three different formats for convenings. The first one has two different forms of that, the dialogues, and then of course the conferences or the conferencing and the confluencing. And I'll describe those first two a little bit more, or yeah, two and a half, so to say. Confluencing actually comes later. Bill, if you just go back just a second. On the dialoguing side, we have two different sorts of dialogues. We started so-called open dialogues, and that already happened last year, which was sort of accidentally in the beginning, but then very planned throughout this year because there were interesting papers where people said, hey, we should have a dialogue on that. And we thought, yeah, that's a good idea. Let's do that. And after that was received so well, we thought, well, maybe this is a format that we can use more often. and convey our message, but also our collective learning in a much better way. So we started our series of so-called open dialogues, and then we also have a specific series on bioregional carrying capacities. And this carries forward some of the bread and butter work that we've been doing also in the first decade of our existence, very much around the idea, when is good good enough? When can you describe something as sustainable or regenerative? And what is it that you need to measure that? And then applying it to the bioregional context. And earlier on, we had mostly applied that to the corporate context, but now also fully making this flourishing in the bioregional context. And then, of course, our conferences and the confluencing. And yeah, we're trying to put more seeds into the garden. The confluencing part will come later. And now we're shifting to the next slide, which already shows you the open dialogues and bioregioning that we've done, six sessions in total. And the first ones were really going into the Adam and Eve, so to say, of bioregioning, the roots of bioregionalism and bridging towards bridging bioregional waves, which is then transforming that into the future. And how can we bring the past and the future together in a way that it flourishes all together? And then this year, when we did this more planned, so to say, we had a session on history of bioregioning, bioregioning in permaculture, and then we broadened it to other continents. For example, we had the South Asia Bioregionalism Working Group in one session, and we had bioregioning in Australia in another session. And then we had a session on bioregional governance and a session on bioregional knowledge commons. Again, you see how the three different pillars, convenings, knowledge commons, self-governance, are sort of interwoven already in these open dialogues on bioregioning. And then we had this specific session, set of sessions on bioregional carrying capacities, which again, it takes forward all the work that we've been doing in the last decade already, when we try to convince everybody in the old world, so to say, that it might be good to know against what you measure your performance. And as that hasn't happened, and bioregions are becoming sort of the unit of measurement, and want to know if they are successful, they will need that sort of know-how as well. So we held 8 of those sessions, and the last one just last week was with Joe and Penny, where they looked at the outer and the inner side of carrying capacities. So the outer sort of like the measurement know-how, but also the inner work that is necessary to really accept that this is something that we need to do. All right, that was that. We're going back into slideshow mode.
Yeah, sorry, I've got an auto rest on my browser. I don't know why it just clicked, but anyway, sorry about that.
Yeah. But Bill, anyway, I would turn it back to you for this one.
Great. Thanks, Ralph. So moving into, and I'll just end by saying on that last slide, just quickly, of course, a reminder that these bioregional carrying capacity sessions are a jointly hosted by the Design School and R3.0. So this last one was sort of bringing that back into full visibility. So shifting into our second garden or pillar, if you will, is bioregional knowledge commons. In particular, we're focusing on the relational side of that, drawing on Melanie Goodchild, who's an Anishinaabe scholar, on relational system thinking, which is essentially the intersection and integration of Indigenous and non-Indigenous knowledge systems. And again, as we said earlier, this draws on our history of co-creating a full generation of 9 blueprints as our first kind of knowledge commons around sustainability. So now we're looking at applying that some of that same strategy towards bioregional knowledge commons. And we are looking at this in 2 strands. One is a community of inquiry and practice, and another is on content development. So on, okay, sorry about this. Is that, okay. Okay, thank you. So the community of inquiry and practice draws on previous communities of inquiry and practice around sustainability that we have hosted. And so we brought in a Venezuelan colleague, Andrea Farias, who's now based in Barcelona, as a research fellow to co-lead this work. And that was in particular because she had already done some important research on this that we'll get to in the next slide. So Andrea and I are co-stewarding this community of inquiry and practice. It currently comprised of about 45 or so participants across 5 continents. And we've got 2 subgroups launched just since earlier this year. One is looking at practices and patterns or ontologies for folks who like the fancy terminology. And this is a graphic that we've used to describe how we're using Christopher Alexander's pattern language to take practices and focus in on them, and then draw out from that what are the common patterns across these practices. So this is even a fractal practice in and of itself. And then the other subgroup is on technology and interoperability between technology platforms, for example. The other side of this is the content development. So on the left-hand side, you can see our, we basically took our existing blueprint series and revamped it to transform it into the Seeds series. One of the ways that we revamped it was to shift to a mode of using interviews with key thought or practice leaders in the area of economic systems and cultures. And so the first volume essentially pulled together the thinking from those 20 players, including Joe we interviewed, into a focusing on the problem identification. The next 2 volumes will focus more on the solutions and in particular how it applies to bioregionalism. The other piece of content that we've recently released is the research that I mentioned earlier by our research fellow, Andrea Farias. She had done independent research on this current state of bioregional knowledge commons. And so we've released a report version of that, and we'll be releasing access to her databases of research in the coming month or so. So that's on the second garden or pillar. The third garden is on self-governing, where we see that as really the bridge between the convening and the bioregional knowledge commoning, in the sense that convening, particularly congressing, it entails self-governance, and self-governance practices would be some of the content that would exist in bioregional knowledge commons. So there are 2 areas that we're focusing on in particular: co-governance and bioregional governance training and development that we're integrating into the transition from the conference to confluences to congressing ultimately. But we're going to explore that more in future slides, so we're not going to go into depth on that right now. It'll come out as we go. So I'm going to pass it back over to Ralph to give a little bit of a historical view of our conferences in the past.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. And we're sometimes astonished that we're already now holding our 12th International R3.0 conference. So it is a more than a decade of conferencing, and you see pictures here from the conferences that happened starting in 2013, and now we are at 2025. And what these pictures and the titles of the conferences also, to a certain degree, frame is that our first decade, nearly our whole first decade, from 2013 to 2022, after the Rio +20 conference, when R3.0 started, is really reflecting a decade of where we thought that through our work we can make a contribution to collapse avoidance, where the idea of the soul searching in the beginning, um, building a systemic and simultaneous leapfrog model of areas that need to move forward, and we called the outcomes of all of these areas blueprints. So every area had its own blueprint, and we constructed 9 or a simultaneous approach for 9 of these blueprints, from reporting to accounting to data gathering, business model design, sustainable finance, values. So what is of value in a regenerative and distributive economy, to transformational education, and to funding governance. So all of these areas all together and all of these blueprints all together formed a first, I would say, knowledge commons. And not only did we have the conferences, but we also had these international working groups of up to 50 people from all over the world that worked on these blueprints for about a year together with us. So it was always very interactive, and there was a standard model of how we did that. So by the end of 2022, when we released the funding for the blueprint for funding governance for systemic transformation, we took stock. And it was also the idea that, well, we've done all this work, and the missing part of all of that is the activation of it. So why are corporates not picking up on this? Why are governments not picking up on that? Why are big major NGOs not picking up on that? Everybody would sort of tell us this is brilliant work. And yes, it would constitute a leapfrog, but nobody took action to really activate it in the way that it needed to be activated. And of course, that was part of the reason that we were already highly advanced in a state of collapse, where everybody was sort of retracting, cocooning, egos, whatever came in the way, everything came in the way. And that we took as the basis also to really go on our own morning journey, where we thought, okay, what is it that that we now need to do going into our second decade as R3.0? And if that work on collapse avoidance is simply too late, what are the fruitful things that we can carry over to a new strategy, or to a changed or adapted strategy that would more reflect on collapse resilience, due to the fact that we're acknowledging that we're in collapse? And that has really changed also the nature of our conference. And you see that also what we did in the last 2 years. Our 10th international conference was on activating restorative norms, healing harm, connecting for change. Or the 11th conference was on tipping points, building necessary collapse resilience. So this was sort of the transition time from collapse avoidance through collapse acknowledgement into collapse resilience. And that brings us to this year's conference on the next slide. Yes, thank you, Bill. Which is our 12th International R3.0 conference, which has the title Braiding Bioregional Resilience and Regeneration, Learning to Re-inhabit Earth Together. So that is sort of like the full focus on bioregioning, because as Joe was already saying, this idea of bioregioning or bioregions as the unit of measurement was with us since John Fullerton first addressed it in the 2015 conference, where he had one slide in his full slide deck where he said, well, you guys, maybe you have the wrong unit of measurement. Maybe you should focus on the bioregion. And we were thinking, oh yeah, John, good idea. Let's see when the time comes. That might be a good thing to do. And the time is now. So with our 2025 conference, we could go back to John and say, hey, John, we're delivering. So in that sense, Bill, on the next slide, we want to just acknowledge that also our funding model has drastically changed. In the past, we did have quite a couple of eager corporates that would chip something in. We had some other classical philanthropic sponsors. And with that move to bioregioning, this has drastically changed. Corporates would not fund any of this. The classical philanthropic foundations would not fund any of this. So this was a huge challenge for us as well. And we had the help of Lankley Chase in that sort of transitioning period, still continuing this year. That helps to also fund what we call our confluencing fund sponsorship. And we'll talk about the confluences later. But the major conference sponsorship comes from Novo Foundation, which, as many of you know, are not only big into what is it?
Indigenous community.
Indigenous work. Sorry, the word. I was just missing the word. Indigenous work, but also are focusing on bioregioning as well, and we take a benefit from that. And without their help, the work that we've been doing this year would have been impossible. So I also want to just acknowledge that and thank both of the sponsors, because the funding streams are drastically changing due to that strategic change that we made. Next slide, Bill. Yeah, this is just an overview of who's going to co-facilitate the conference. Of course, Bill and myself, but also Jennifer Nucci will do parts of the facilitation, and Andrea Farias, who was already mentioned on the Bioregional Knowledge Commons page, is also helping out with part of the co-facilitation of the conference. And then one more slide for me, Bill. This is the conference coherence circle. We were thinking, in that what Bill was describing, building coherence, but especially also avoiding decoherence. We were thinking, can we just gather like-minded institutions into a conference coherence circle to just simply, strengthen the coherence in the bioregional movement, inviting those key players to join this circle, just as a feedback loop for supporting mutual reinforcement between the conference and the confluencing and the movement overall. And who knows, whenever it goes to congressing, how that will further evolve. So this is also to showcase that we're doing this in collaboration and in coherence with others. And you would see some of the speakers at the conference come from these organizations. So it's only natural to a certain degree that they also became part of this conference coherence circle. And with the next slide, I think I'll hand it over back to Bill, who will go into the different days of the conference and describe a little bit more about that.
Sounds great. Thank you, Ralph. I guess the last thing, I'll add one other thing to the conference coherence circle. We just heard this morning a confirmation that the South Asia Bioregionalism Working Group is going to join us in that, which is indeed thumbs up, Joe. That's sort of ties into our work on not only, creating coherence amongst players that have been engaged for a while, but also what I mentioned earlier, the sort of globalization of the bioregional movement. So in terms of the agenda for the conference, it follows a fairly similar pattern on the first 2 days. So we have an opening keynote, a panel session, followed by mindful movement, and then a break, and then a bioregional experience, art experience, and then a second panel session and a keynote to close the day. So that's what I'm going to walk you through the first day, and then it'll be a similar setup for the second day, and then the third day is completely different. So anyway, that's just the pattern that you'll see. We kick off with an invocation on sacred obligations from Eastern Pequot Tribal Council member Jelani Fletcher, who this is an invocation or a commitment that he repeats every day when he wakes up. And I'm doing some collaborating directly with Jelani and others from two of the Pequot nations in Southeast Connecticut that are part of the local bioregional work that I'm doing as part of the broader bioregional work that R3.0 does broadly. And then we move into the opening keynote, and you may recognize those two people. Yeah, you got to do the hands open like that. Yeah, there we go. So, and this picks up actually on the thread that we've been talking about, which is how bioregionalism itself brings coherence to regeneration of the earth. So what Joe and Penny are doing is looking not just at the coherence of the bioregional movement, but more broadly, how the bioregional movement is helping to bring coherence to earth regeneration. And so that is going to do an important job in terms of setting the tone of the overall conference. We then move into the first session, which also is framed in a head nod to work that Joe and Penny and Susan and Brian are doing with Bioregional Earth. So we borrowed that frame for this first session, and we are talking about braiding bioregions globally across three horizons. So one element is the three horizons concept from Bill Sharp and the International Futures Forum, where we're looking at the first horizon as the kind of current status quo of nation state geopolitical paradigm. And that's going to be talked about by Stan Smith, the permanent ambassador to the of the Bahamas to the United Nations. So we're going to have a United Nations perspective. But then we're mostly going to hear from the other four speakers who are representing bioregions, not only individual bioregions, but in particular, this kind of cross-bioregional braiding that we think is really important for the globalization or the creation of a true bioregional Earth. And so I won't go into depth on what each speaker is doing. You can look for more depth on that on both the R3.0 conference website, our social media, and our newsletters, where we play out, what each is doing in more depth. But just to say that we have Atossa Sultani from talking about the Amazon Sacred Headwaters Alliance. We have Michelle Maloney from the Australian Earth Laws Alliance, speaking about, in particular, Indigenous relational governance. Nisha Mary Palus from the South Asia Bioregionalism Working Group, talking about their work on mapping the bioregions of India and beyond, in particular, sort of reconfiguring the colonization that happened in the mapping out of India into an empire-based boundaries. And then finally, Susan Bosak from both the Legacy Project that is stewarding the seventh generation Greater Takaranto bioregion. So she's doing specific bioregional work, and then also working with the narrative of bioregional Earth with Joe and Penny. So we'll end on that front. So then, and again, we have a mindful movement break that gives us about 10 minutes to have a somatic experience that's facilitated by Jennifer Diana-Nucci, and then an actual break, and then a bioregional arts experience. So that's our sort of hour-long break in those three segments. Then we come back to another panel session on relational bioregional knowledge commons, bridging practices and patterns across cultures. So again, you can start to see the thematic threads that we're weaving here. This is going to be co-facilitated by Andrea Farias, our research fellow, who will also be doing some presenting of her work on the research as well as the stewarding of the bioregional knowledge commons. Warinqui Flores is an indigenous scientific scholar who will be focusing in particular on on autonomy of bioregional commons and sovereignty of indigenous knowledge, such that indigenous knowledge can be shared in appropriate ways and also conserved or not shared as is relevant or necessary. Wendy McLean from the Omni Mapping Initiative and with Catalyst will be sharing about, in particular, the way that technology and other sources can help set a backbone or an interoperable pattern of backbone for the bioregional knowledge commons movement. Magenta Light will talk about the Bloom Network as a platform that is doing two things. One is supporting the interoperability between and amongst knowledge platforms, and then also using her platform's ability to gather together resources, particularly financial resources, and flow them to practitioners on the ground. Not only regenerative practice practitioners, but also the knowledge documenters who are working side by side with them. And then finally, Datu Lanelio Sankon is a node on the Bloom network. So those two are kind of paired together, and he will talk about the work that his organization, Tribes and Nature Defenders, is enacting on the ground in the Philippines, in particular, documenting the indigenous knowledge practices there, and their documenting of that on Bloom Network. Finally, we round out the day with the second keynote from Lila June Johnston, who's spoken at our conference in the past, focusing on indigeneity and bioregioning. So in the past, she's talked about this sort of millennial scale history of Native American bioregional landscape management through indigenous regenerative ecosystem design strategies, or IRED, as she calls it in her doctoral dissertation. So in this keynote, Lila June is going to use that as a foundation to reflect on the intersectionality between indigenous communities' knowledge and regenerative practices and the bioregioning movement. So she's going to look at how the bioregioning movement can build on indigenous knowledge in ways that are respectful and mutually beneficial, but not misappropriation and co-optation. That brings us through the first day. The second day, as I said, mirrors a similar pattern, so I won't go into that in depth. I'll go right into the sessions themselves. So the first thing we kick off is with a embodied pro-social matrix exercise. So Jennifer Diana-Nucci, our engagement architect, as well as Ralph and I, are all certified pro-social facilitators. And so in some of our work before we committed to bioregionalism, Jennifer innovated a way to deliver the pro-social matrix in an embodied way, in a somatic way. And so she's going to lead an exercise walking us through the pro-social matrix in this embodied way as a way for all of us to further embody our learnings in this conference. So that's the intro session. The second session of the day, the third panel session, will be on relational bioregional co-governance, cross-cultural self-determination. And so while most of the sessions are broad in scope geographically, we wanted to have at least one session that honed in on one bioregion. And so both Mike Thomas from the Mashantucket Pequot tribal nation, and he's the chair of the Mashantucket Pequot Museum and Research Center, where we will actually be hosting a local confluence for the Northeast Woodlands Bioregioning Collective that I participate in. So Mike and Maggie Fevretti, who is with the Alliance for the Mystic River Watershed, together they are innovating with the rest of us in the collective an approach to co-governance between indigenous and non-indigenous communities, in particular between our bioregional collective and the Intertribal Alliance that Mike is and others are creating in the New England area. So that will be a nod to our work on governance, just like we had a nod to the work on bioregional knowledge commons. Then our fourth session is on bioregional resourcing, regenerating and sustaining diverse resource flows. So we have Samantha Power from the BioFi project, who's spoken at our conference in the past and who I'm sure you're familiar with their work. She's going to move from the BioFi project in general to talking about the cultivator project that they worked on and specific bioregions implementing bioregional financing facilities. Will Ruddick will talk about grassroots economics and how he's using pooling commitments in a community basis. Natalia Ortiz is working with the Barichara Regeneration Fund and the North Andes Regeneration Fund. And so looking at, again, a fractal approach to work, not just in the Barichara context of a single bioregion, but the whole North Andes context that is building out resource flows of both funds and other resources. Finally, Daniela Sinkel is a research associate with R3.0. She will talk about the fractal relationship between ecological and social resources, and particular respecting their carrying capacities at a municipal scale and at a bioregional scale. So that carries us through the panel sessions. We then end with our last keynote from Vanessa Andreotti, who's just released her book, Outgrowing Modernity. She's spoken at our session, our conference in the past. But this time, she's going to draw on the interview that we did with her for the R3.0 Seed series, where she talked about the concept of narrow boundary intelligence that she's drawing from Daniel Schmachtenberg, which she sees as enacting entitlements to entitlements, that's essentially the paradigm we're working from right now. And we really need to shift to a responsibilities for responsibilities as a kind of wide boundary intelligence of what she's now calling meta-relationality in order to enact collapse resilience. And she's going to apply this analysis to the bioregional context. So again, you can see relationality coming in back again and again and again. So that takes us through the conference. Now we're going to shift focus to the confluences. And our third day is focused on a global confluence debrief. So I think this is where I hand it back to you, Ralph, and you do a few slides on the confluence side of things. So over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. So we're the idea of the confluences, of course, is that they run in parallel to the conference itself. The idea is that confluences on the ground, local meetings in different sizes would actually screen the conference and then translate whatever is happening there to their own context and discuss it and build a program around that. So we invited all conference organizers, and you will see in later slides that we have around about 45 of them in 6 different continents, which is a challenge to handle it by itself, to also reflect on their findings. And we want to do this on a conference debrief day. The first one is September 11, where we have different rounds of reflections, and then also a keynote by David Henke and Laura Curry that Bill's going to talk about a little bit later. So this is just a very simple setup for the day. And also to mention that as we're sort of screening around the globe, for some, it is very difficult time zone wise. So what we also organize is that we are sharing recordings of both days to those confluence organizers that need to organize their confluence at a different point in time, but in a time frame that they can come back on September 18, where we are going to organize a second of these confluence debrief days. Then later on, we're going to make recordings available to everybody, but not during that 1 week. So the bioregional confluencing is really stemming from an idea that we started last year when some of our participants in our hybrid conferences, which were both online and face-to-face, were sort of saying, well, we still want to meet face-to-face if you're doing a fully online conference. But can we do that with lower footprint and with more handprint? And now what our partners and advocacy partners in Belgium organized a first of these conferences last year at last year's conference, which was already fully online. And that became a very successful meeting. So we said this year, why are we not going to so make this bigger and invite others to hold these conferences? And yeah, like I said, we now have a total list of 45 of those. And they might reduce a little bit because some are sort of starting to mingle their conference together into one. But that's also good because that's community building in a different way, or in a way that they find themselves, because they're sometimes not so far away from each other. They find it out through the conference website. And then mingle together. I should also say that one of the things that has been a problem for these conference organizers, of course, is venues, finance, and stuff like that. So we made available a part of our core budget to support conferences financially. Not going to pay all the cost, but at least a contribution to allow for maybe a venue, or maybe for some technical support. And those, sorry for my coughing, those are about 30 conferences that signed up for that in the time frame that we set until end of May. But as you heard me saying, we have about 45 now, so there are more that are not eligible for that level of funding. And Bill, if you go to the next slide, again, that confluencing fund sponsorship comes from Lankley Chase, one of our core funders. And we have asked people to sign up for one of three types of conferences. One would be just the standard sort of like a living room conference where you come together, you lock your computer to a TV set or something like that, and then you screen the conference from there, and then you discuss. And then we do have two more types, the bigger ones, a mid-sized conference and a bigger, larger conference. That would be like 10 to 20 people or beyond 20 people. Bill, the next slide is showing how we are supporting those conference organizers. One of the things that And Now What and we did together is pulling together some sort of conference guidance document. So how can we help conference organizers in setting up their own conference, and what sort of mechanisms can take place, what sort of level of depth of the discussion can emerge out of these conferences, just simply depending on what sort of group you have as your conference. And we also supplied them other documents from the early days of bioregional congressing from David Hankey, that Bill has edited, I think, if I remember well. So they had a whole set of different documents to look into, and we organized in total 5 conference organizer prep calls, in which we very nicely already saw how those people organizing these conferences, just coming together in these prep calls, started to build community already. It was a very nice process to see that, actually. And now I think on the next 1 or 2 slides, oh no, there's one more, where we also sort of, again, with this idea of seeds and building gardens, moved forward and just gave people a glimpse of how this confluencing movement can lead to something more around congressing. And we invited organizations like Metagov and Open Civics, Sociocracy for All and Pro-Social to also, give us a first sort of like a kickstart into that idea. And now, Bill, on the next slide, what you see here is that what we have on our conferencing webpage, which is a sub-page to the conference website, where we were just collecting all of these conferences. And as they were becoming more and more, we also structured them or clustered them by continents. And if you go to that site, you will see them clustered per continent. And what we also did is that we organized it in a way that you have this little arrows on the right side of each of those conferences, which is the expression of toggles. So it's like a pull-down menu where conference organizers can input contact information, or if they want to say more about their conference, or if they want to invite more people, they can do that there. So everybody can sort of find more information about each individual conference on these pages. Next page, Bill. So yeah, following Australia, South America, and Europe, we have quite a nice mix of those. And then on the next page, you see the North American continent, which is a bigger number of those conferences there, just because also of the past of bioregioning also in North America, which is further developed than in other parts of the world. So here's an overview of all of these conferences on the website. They're just below each other. So there's a whole list that you can scroll through, and you can also find if there is a conference nearby where you live, and if you might want to join that. So that's an opportunity for you to find out and to then become active by yourself in contacting these people and seeing if you can join their conference. Or, if there's nothing around you, you can organize your own conference. Time is coming sort of short to do that, but if you have a functioning bioregional group, you can still apply for a conference and be part of that. All right, I think that was me. And as my coughing continues, I'm happy to hand it over to Bill.
I'll try not to catch the coughing, Ralph. And just a few more slides. Apologies, this is going a little bit longer than we had intended. Mostly on me. I was intending to do the each session a little shorter in the conference, and I couldn't resist going a little bit more in depth. So finally, the Confluence debrief days are primarily these Confluence reflections, where they're really reflecting on two components. What are the learnings that happened from the conference material or from their own dialogue on the conference material in that Confluence? The other element is we have framed these confluences as autonomous from the get-go. So they can do whatever they want. The conference is not a full day of programming. It's about maybe 2/3 or 3/4 of a day. And so there's plenty of time that these confluences can do some of their own bioregional work. And so that's something that we're wanting to hear back on as well. Both of these are intended to create a cross-pollination of learnings so that if one bioregion sort of hears an idea that another bioregion is using, that they can, pick that up or talk directly to that other bioregion. And we've already seen this happening. We, as Ralph mentioned, we only scheduled 3 calls of guidance calls to begin with. And at the 3rd call, the Confluence organizers themselves were like, hey, can we keep this going? And we were like, absolutely, sure. And one of the things that we started to do, we used that opportunity to start integrating the next step, which is from these confluences. The confluence has always been conceived of as a stepping stone towards revitalizing the practice of bioregional congresses or congressing. And so that's what our keynote on that day is going to be focused on. The idea of sort of ambling towards continent Congress is an essay that Peter Berg wrote in 1976. And then David Henke, having not read that work at the time, introduced a bioregional congress at the Ozark scale, and then helped to create the North American Bioregional Congress 4 years later in 1984. So David is going to present on that history. Laura Curry was one of the co-organizers of the first Continental Bioregional Congress in the Global South in Mexico, so still part of the Turtle Island or North America continental bioregional context. So both of them will share not only their work on bioregional Congress organizing, but how they have also applied that beyond the Congress context to bioregional governance more broadly. So that kind of takes you through the conference, the associated confluences. The last thing that we wanted to share was giving you a view of where this is all headed. So we foresaw this as wanting to support bioregions to revitalize this practice of bioregional congressing at the bioregional scale, and then next at the continental scale, and then ultimately at the planetary scale. And as you can see here, we come back to our theme of fractal coherence in the bioregional movement. And so we kind of expected that to take a couple of years to get to the continental scale. So that would, maybe be in 2027, but already North America or Turtle Island has a long history of continental scale bioregional congresses, 10 in the past. So I am participating in a small group that also includes Carrie Crisp and Brandon Letzinger and David Henke and others who are organizing a Continental Bioregional Congress in 2026 for Turtle Island or North America. And so this is the website for that Congress. There's potential talk about having that happen around the same time as next year's R3.0 conference, so that there can be some interweaving or braiding between those two events. So that brings us through what we wanted to present today, and we wanted to go over to hand it back to Joe to facilitate the rest of the session. And again, apologies for taking a little bit longer than we intended, but we hope that that was helpful information.
Well, I think I can speak on behalf of everyone here. I'm saying, wow, it's so impressive what you all are doing and what you're holding. And as someone who has participated in both your conferences and your blueprint processes in the past, I have a really deep respect and appreciation for the thoughtfulness with which you do all of this work. And so I'd love to invite people who have questions and comments to just raise your hand and we can start a queue. But as we're waiting for that to happen, I wanted to make a comment and then invite a question. And so the comment that I wanted to make is that the way that you're holding this process through the confluences is very complementary to having people join the design school and continue in the design school afterwards, where we're starting to design a process of restructuring our Mighty Networks platform to enable people to do public-facing organizing in their own bioregions as part of the network, so that we can support the ongoing learning exchanges of the planetary network of bioregions. So my comment is just naming that there is a really beautiful complementarity to this, and that Bill and Ralph don't need to carry that forward, that we're actually deeply synergistic in structure. And so just naming that. And then my question for either Bill or Ralph, before I see it, that Bruce has his hand up, so we'll go to Bruce after this. So whichever of you would like to answer this, my question to you is, how do you see the work you're doing creating this buffering against that decoherence or destruction of coherence? Just maybe a comment on that, because I'd love to hear you embellish or elaborate a little bit more. So whichever of you would like to share.
I can say something first. Ralph might also have thoughts, so you might end up hearing from both of us, but I'll try to be brief. I would say one thing that we did immediately in the beginning of 2025 was recognize that bioregionalism was, that there was fragmentation that was sort of natural on a global scale. So in other words, there was activity happening in various different areas throughout the globe, but that it wasn't really braided or woven together particularly. So that is one of the reasons, as Ralph mentioned when he was talking about the open dialogues, we wanted to make sure to have some of our early open dialogues start to do that weaving work. And so choosing to start with the South Asia Bioregionalism Working Group, or the work in Australia, or even before that, the bioregioning and permaculture focused on work happening in Africa, and particularly Elias, who's here in the design school, and also Gloire, who's applying permaculture in camps for displaced communities. So that's one element that we are kind of consciously trying to bring coherence by simply expanding the interrelationship on a geographic span. The other that I'll just say briefly is the conference coherence circle is really a Trojan horse, if you will, or we're starting with the conference, but we really want that body to be ongoing, to help to convene a place where we can at least pursue the question of coherence. We don't think that we as R3.0 could necessarily, create coherence, but we think that we can play a role in helping to steward that. So those are my two quick thoughts, and Ralph, over to you if you have other things to jump on top of that with.
Yeah, thanks, Bill, and thanks for the question, Joe. I think the buffering comes from looking at things from many different perspectives. And one of the things, and that is something that we carry over from our first generation of work or first decade of work, is that whenever we think of transformation, we think of it from the micro level or the nano level, the personal level, the micro level, which can be, or in the past was more the organizational level. Now, it becomes the bioregion, for example, the meso level, which can be, or it was an industry, now it is regional, bioregional, and then the macro level. How would systems need to change? So you need to think things through when you do them or organize them, that they are respected on all four different levels. And that's the biggest, I would say, shortcoming in most of the transformational literature, but also especially what consultancies offer. They only focus on one level. And in most cases, it's the micro level, because they think they can transform an organization, but how can they do that if the whole context isn't changing? That's a recipe for disaster, so to say. But that's too complex for our consultancies, so they don't do that. So it's up to people like us to look at it from a multi-level perspective. And that's one buffer I would mention. A second one is just looking at timelines. Also recognizing that none of what we're discussing right now was invented by us in some way. It had a past and will have a future. And the whole idea of intergeneral equity, which is really one of the basics of understanding sustainability, is not just to look 7 generations ahead. It also means to minimally look 7 generations to the back, or to the past. So that's another buffer where you can simply say, no, this was not invented by sort of Waldorf and Stadler, Ralph and Bill. It is joint work, and it has been past work, and it will be future work, and it will be work in togetherness, which is a buffer in itself, I think, as well. And then, of course, inviting all different parts of the world into that journey, I think, is another buffer. And even though it's difficult and cultures are difficult and different, it is necessary weaving work that needs to be done. And the last thing that I would just simply mention, again, transporting one of our bread and butter issues from the past into the future, is the whole measurement of success. And that is where our work from the first decade is as important, or even more important, as it was in the past, where corporations said, it's brilliant, but thank you, we're not doing it, because it would only prove our level of unsustainability. So yeah, we carry that forward. And these are all sort of buffers. And by that, there's a whole dimension, a multidimensional picture of different buffers that come together.
Thank you so much for that. I think the insight into these systemic kinds of feedbacks both reveal the the depth of the work that you've been doing and also the significance of holding that multi-level point of view, which you know that we also hold, and that it is inherently confusing to people. So it's something that requires a lot of discernment. Thank you both to Bill and Ralph for first, all of the great work that you're doing. It's just so important. And we really encourage all of the members of the design school to participate. Many of you already are, in hosting confluences in the conference and in this larger weaving process that is so important to hold. And so we're now at time. So I just want to be respectful of the time and say thank you again, Ralph and Bill, for presenting today. This session will be made publicly available so that you can share it with others, so they can learn more about the great work that R3.0 is doing. And so just wanted to say thank you all for being here today. And we're looking forward to more. So onward, fellow humans. And we'll talk to you all soon.
Thank you all.